A reading from the Gospel according to Mark. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elisha with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. Recently, I had the pleasure of attending a public Zoom meeting on creating just social change in our community. You don't have to have been there to know exactly how the meeting went. First of all, people inadvertently kept cutting each other off. Second, the people with the most background noise couldn't seem to find their mute button, and this led to just screen after screen of people just staring into their cameras, looking depressed, exhausted, or some combination of the two. The organizer could barely get a word out of most people, which meant that the majority of our time was spent listening to the 2 biggest talkers just go back and forth. At the end of the meeting, I was really glad that it wasn't my meeting. It's Jesus's meeting this morning, and it is perhaps comforting to those of us who lead meetings to know that even the Son of God sometimes commits meeting-leading faux pas. For instance, Jesus can't seem to mute Peter. That's a theme for most of the Gospels. And second, Jesus makes the mistake of bringing too many people to the meeting. He brings Peter, James, and John up the mountaintop, seemingly to just stand there, while he has a private conversation with Moses and Elijah. Why does he bring his disciples along today? The answer to that question is not found in this text, but the one preceding it, right? We start with 6 days later. So what happened 6 days earlier was that Jesus shared with his disciples the bad news that he would be crucified. Peter was very upset about that and tried to talk him out of it. Jesus called Peter Satan, because, that's how an argument goes. And then Jesus doubles down and says, not only will I be crucified, but each of you will need to carry the cross. I imagine how the disciples felt after that. Perhaps they looked like all of those people in the public Zoom meeting, depressed, exhausted, despondent, some combination of the 3. If you are in that headspace, if you are in that zoned out, exhausted headspace, or you have been at any point this past week, you are not alone. Zoom fatigue is just one part of pandemic fatigue. There's also the isolation fatigue, the boredom fatigue, the not having anything on the calendar to look forward to fatigue. And then greater still, there is the mortality fatigue. When we feel isolated and alone, it becomes even more overwhelming to look upon the suffering of the world, the suffering of our neighbors. To paraphrase Pascal, just as the knowledge of God without our frailty creates pride, the knowledge of our frailty without God creates despair. Perhaps Jesus senses this despair. Perhaps Jesus knows that it is simply too much to bear the cross, even the knowledge of the cross alone. Perhaps Jesus thinks these frail, fallible, beloved humans need a glimpse of the glory of the one who is with them always. They need to see how their present struggle is part of the greater story, a part of God's story. Perhaps even in this difficult time, you've seen glimpses of God's story in the kindness of strangers, in the courage of frontline workers, in the faithful witness of those who continue to call for justice and reform. We see such glimpses all the time. We see such glimpses all the time. I have come to believe that at any moment, anywhere on this broken earth, the face of God can reveal itself in our midst. The question is, do we notice the transfiguration that is happening before us? How do we respond to the transfiguration in our midst? Most of the time, we miss it, just like Peter. Jesus, I see that you're showing us a glimpse of God's kingdom, but all I have the capacity for right now is the most mundane of tasks. So, while you're having a sort of cosmic explosion of wonder, I'm going to go over there and set up the tent. In times of despair and exhaustion, will we ignore God's presence with us? Will we ignore God's calling us and hide away in whatever it is that can keep us occupied for that scary moment? Or will we allow ourselves to be changed by the glimpses of God that we encounter? The season of Lent is entirely about noticing God's presence in our lives and allowing ourselves to be transformed by God's presence. I want to invite you to join us this Wednesday, February 17th, for a time of bravely remembering our human frailty, our human mortality, and trusting that out of this frailty, God is doing something new. I invite you also to take time in this Lenten season to not only encounter God's presence, but to reflect on what that presence can mean in your life, how that presence can change your life. Starting on February 23rd, we'll be gathering each Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time on Zoom. Now, I know I bashed Zoom at the top of the sermon, but give it a chance. I assure you, our congregation totally knows how to use the mute button. We are like Zoom experts. You will feel right at home, and we'll be breaking out into small groups, so it won't be as bad as a public meeting, I swear. And so I hope you'll join us in this remembering of God's presence and this opening of ourselves to God's presence in our lives. I hope you'll join us in not despairing, or at least in not allowing despair to have the final word. And so let us trust that God is with us, that God reveals God's self in our very midst, and that God continues to transform us in this season and in all the seasons to come. Thanks be to God.